Imagine you're sitting down for dinner, about to have a nice dinner with your family, when all of a sudden there's a knock at the door. You go to the door, you open the door, and there are cops standing there, and they say they have a warrant for your arrest. You're confused, you don't know what's going on, and you ask, what's the crime?
You told someone about Jesus, and because that person was under the age of 18, you are now facing 2 years in jail.
That's the reality of what potentially could happen in Israel right now. For Christians and believers, there's a bill presented in the nation that would make it a criminal offense to tell people about Jesus. 1 year in prison if the person you tell is an adult. 2 years in prison if the person you tell about Jesus was under the age of 18. Why does this matter to you if you're not in Israel? We're going to talk about it. Let's go.
Conservative Christian leaders are calling on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stop a bill proposed by members of his coalition to make it criminal to tell people about Jesus in Israel. Our Jerusalem correspondent Daniel Cohen is live near Tel Aviv with more. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Allison. Good morning, everyone. A big story just days before Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Easter. Sacred time for Christians. 2 ultra-Orthodox members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition have introduced a bill that would punish believers for sharing the gospel of Jesus with prison time. United Torah Judaism Knesset members Moshe Gafni and Yaakov Asher introduced legislation last week making it illegal to share in conversation or produce content online, in print, or by mail. Their explanation of the bill emphasizes a warning to stop Christians in particular. The punishment, 1 year in prison or 2 years for sharing with someone under the age of 18. Gafni first introduced a ban on evangelism in 1999. It went nowhere. United Torah Judaism is in a stronger negotiating position now, though, since Netanyahu needs to keep the party in his coalition, or it could threaten Netanyahu's ability to remain in power.
I had a completely different video planned for today, but then this story jumped off the page at me. And there's something that I think is key that unfortunately I think so many people miss. When I read through the comments of this story, there were tons of comments of people saying, this is end times prophecy fulfilled. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. Oh, this is going to happen. Of course they rejected Jesus. Then you had another handful of comments that amounted to nothing more than, get 'em, God. Unfortunately, both responses are incorrect biblically. Yes, it is true that biblical prophecy does indicate that until the very end, Israel is going to not accept Jesus as their Messiah. Israel is going to reject Jesus. But unfortunately, so many people miss what Scripture actually teaches because they have wrong theology about Israel and the church and what our relationship is. There's many people who teach that Israel and God's plan for Israel is completely separate from God's plan for the church, and we're not connected at all.
Don't mix us up.
And God has one plan for Israel, a different plan for the church, and once the church is raptured and taken out of here,
beam me up, Jesus.
Then God will turn his attention back to Israel and deal with Israel. And then you have another group of people who gets it wrong by saying God has no plan for Israel at all. Israel's done and the church has replaced Israel.
You've been selected as his replacement.
Both of those are false.
Lord, you are dead wrong. Dead wrong.
Let's look at Romans chapter 11. We're going to real quickly discuss the importance of your role as a Christian in the nation of Israel. In Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, Paul deals with Israel and their rejection of God and what that means for the Gentiles and what that means for the gospel as a whole. In the first 29 verses of Romans 9, Paul makes the argument that it was God's eternal plan, that Israel rejecting God was part of his eternal plan. And then in the rest of chapter 9, going into the first 21 verses of chapter 10, Paul makes the argument that Israel rejected God by their own choosing. So while it was a part of God's eternal plan, they also willingly chose to play out that role in the plan. So this leads to a question that Paul opens chapter 11 with. So has God cast away his people? In other words, if it was part of God's plan for them to reject him and they willingly chose it, is it over? Is it all said and done? Israel's done? Is that the plan? Is that what God's saying? And the response is certainly not.
Sorry to those who hold the replacement theology.
Now look at Romans chapter 11 verse 2. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they've killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. So Paul makes the case, God's people, Israel, the Jews, are not cast away forever. There is a remnant set aside for God. So Paul then goes on to explain how God has set aside a remnant, but the rest of Israel has stumbled, the rest of Israel has fallen, the rest of Israel has walked away and rejected Jesus.
It's hard to imagine what they were thinking.
Now look at verse 11. It says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now if their fall is the riches of the world and their failure riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be except life from the dead?
Raised from the dead.
Paul is making this argument that they've stumbled and many have fallen and rejected Jesus, but it's not permanent. There will be a turning back. There will be an acceptance of Jesus in Israel. And he says that the Gentiles being saved, us, the church, the saved Gentiles, are to provoke Israel to jealousy. That it is our relationship with God, us being saved, us being reconciled to God, us being redeemed to God. Our relationship with God provokes Israel to jealousy. Now this is important. What does that mean, provoke them to jealousy? There is a difference between jealousy and envy, and a lot of times we use those words interchangeably, but they're different. Envy is coveting. It's wanting something that doesn't belong to you. Whereas jealousy, in the context we are talking about, is when you look at someone else who has something that rightly belongs to you. Let me give you an example. The Bible tells us that God is a jealous God. And that is stated as he's giving the law to Israel. And he is saying that he is a jealous God. He's not going to share the affection of Israel with anyone else. Why? Because they rightfully belong to him, because he has made covenant with them. He has cut covenant. Another good example in the natural, normal world, here and now, I am jealous for my wife's heart. If some other man came and began to try to woo the heart of my wife,
What did he just say?
He woos her. Woo!
a righteous jealousy would rise up in me. Why? Because she is rightfully mine. We cut covenant together. She is my wife, and a jealousy would rise up. I would be jealous for her, not jealous of her. That's envy. I would be jealous for her. That is jealousy versus envy. And here, Gentiles, the Christian church, should be provoking to jealousy Israel. We should be making the Jews and Israel want what we have. Why? Because a relationship with God is rightfully theirs by covenant. God issued the new covenant. And if you go back and read Jeremiah and read the Old Testament, the new covenant belongs to Israel. Now, that being said, it was God's plan that they would reject him so that the new covenant would go to the world and not just Israel. But the covenant belongs to Israel. It's the new covenant of Israel. Very important point. So we didn't replace Israel. Our job is to provoke them to want the relationship with God we have. In Romans 11 verse 17, Paul gives us an analogy, very important analogy. Let's read it. It says, and if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and the severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted back in, for God is able to graft them in again. Here's the key. Here's what Paul's saying. We're talking Jews. Individual Jews are the branches of the natural olive tree. You are branches from a wild olive tree, Gentiles. Believers are branches who were cut off from the wild olive tree and grafted into the tree, the natural tree. The natural tree is Israel. The Jews were cut off. Certain unbelieving Jews were cut off from the tree, and Gentiles were grafted in, but the tree itself is still Israel, and the root is God, is Jesus. So you have this natural tree of Israel. We have been grafted in, but the goal is that the Jews will be grafted back into their own tree. The unbelieving Jews will get saved. That's the key. Our goal in prophecy, we talk end time prophecy. The end time prophecy isn't, oh, they're going to reject Jesus, that's just the way it is. End time prophecy is Gentiles are going to provoke the Jews to jealousy to bring them back to their Messiah, Jesus. We are together. It's not replacement theology. We didn't replace Israel. It's also not separation theology. We aren't separate from Israel, which is dispensationalism. No, we are connected to Israel. We are connected to them. It's the tree of Israel. We were grafted into their tree, and we are there to provoke them back to jealousy so they return back to God.
Yes, preach!
Why? Because when they return back to God, what is it except life from the dead? Jesus returning all stems around Israel coming back to Jesus. Now look at Romans 11 verse 25. It says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved." Notice what this says. It says that all Israel is going to be saved when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. The fullness of the Gentiles, some people have tried to take that to mean the full number of Gentiles that God knows will be saved, but that doesn't seem to be what Paul has in mind, because he uses this word earlier in the chapter. If we back up to verse 12, he says, "If their fall," talking about Israel, "if their fall is riches to the world, how much more their fullness?" So the idea that he's talking about is not the number, but rather failure, rejection, or walking in the fullness of the gospel, walking in the fullness of what God has said and done. So what appears to be, in my opinion, I could be wrong, but what it appears to me from this chapter, it's not saying that the full number of Gentiles get saved, but rather that the Gentiles who get saved begin to walk in the fullness of everything Jesus paid for at the cross, which ultimately we know this happens at the end when Jesus returns, and it provokes them to jealousy. So what does this have to do with you? Right now, when you see stories like this coming out of Israel, your immediate response should not be anger. Your immediate response should not be, oh well, this is just what's going to happen because it's the end times. Your immediate response should be, I pray that they are awakened to their true Messiah, and I pray that my life begins to be a reflection of what it means to walk in relationship with God, to provoke them to jealousy. Pray for the peace of Israel. Stand with Israel, not in their actions, not in everything they do politically, but for their salvation. And in prayer before the God of heaven, that you would stand with them, that they would encounter Jesus, and you would provoke them to jealousy. That's the prayer. Till next time.